I'm going to begin by introducing myself in the language as I have been taught to do. Halito, Sahachifoy at Megan Pizer at Chato Oyosia, Barry Pizer Anki, Beverly Payne Supokni, Oklahoma Atachata, Awawiantnag Atali. Hello, my name is Megan Pizer. I am a citizen of Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, the daughter of Barry Pizer and the granddaughter of Beverly Payne. My people's removal lands are in Oklahoma, but I currently reside in what the Anishinaabe people know as where the curved shores meet, but what is temporarily called Detroit. I'm Associate Professor of English at Oakland University and the Vice President of BSA, and I'll be beginning with a land acknowledgement this evening. I'm opening our meeting with the land acknowledgement that BSA has adopted. Land acknowledgements are recently taken up as a practice of settler colonial institutions, but they are actually an indigenous practice. They are how we ever remind ourselves as humans, the youngest Earth relative, that everything we are and everything we do is supported by the land that sustains us. They are an awareness of our small place in a larger balanced system and a promise to commit to our role in keeping that balance. The Bibliographical Society conducts its business on the traditional and ancestral lands and waters of the Lenni Lenape people in Lenapehoking, currently known by settlers as New York City. The BSA recognizes the Lenni Lenape's preferred land acknowledgement to honor their people and territory. The Society gathers people together at events across the North and South American continents on the traditional and ancestral lands and waters of Indigenous peoples who were and still are forcibly removed from their lands. The BSA acknowledges the exclusion and erasures of Indigenous peoples in the places where we work and gather. The Society recognizes its identity as a cultural heritage organization with roots in predominantly white settler scholarship. The BSA's presence across space is tied to colonial enterprises across the Americas, particularly in academia, and this presence has led to the exclusion and erasure of Indigenous voices in our publications, past programming, and the composition of our membership committees and council. In order to address and rectify these absences, the Society is committed to promoting and uplifting scholarship in the field of Indigenous bibliography by expanding financial support for fellowships, research, and events in this academic discipline. These ongoing efforts are part of the BSA's implementation of its Equity Action Plan to inform all aspects of the Society's work. Recognizing that the Society's existence as an organization is intertwined with and has benefited from settler colonialism, the BSA is taking active efforts to make amends by supporting honoraria for the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape tribal nation in Lenapehoking. Because the BSA has members across the Americas, we encourage our constituents to support land back initiatives in their communities by finding out what tribal community is tied to the land where you work and live, and donating to those local tribal communities if you're able to. The Society is also committed to supporting Native lands by divesting its endowments from investments derived from fossil fuels and taking environmental, social, and governance considerations into account in its investment strategies. By pursuing fossil fuel-free investing, the BSA seeks to mitigate the negative impacts of climate change that put the long-term preservation of material culture at risk. You can also make a donation to the Lenape Land Trust by using the PayPal link that you'll see around. Thank you. Yakoke to all of my Lenape kin.
Good afternoon. My name is Caroline Duracell-Milish, and I am the president of the Bibliographical Society of America. And today I am delighted to introduce Daniela Bliechmar, this year's keynote speaker. Her lecture is sponsored by the Independent Online Booksellers Association. Daniela Bliechmar is professor of art history and history at the University of Southern California, where she also serves as the founding director of the Levin Institute for the Humanities. Her research and teaching address the history of images, objects, and text in colonial Latin America and early modern Europe, focusing on the histories of science and knowledge production, cultural encounters and exchanges, collecting, and books. Her research has been supported by the Mellon Foundation, the Getty Foundation, the Getty Research Institute, and the ACLS, among others. Her publications include the books Visible Empire, Botanical Expeditions and Visual Culture in the Hispanic Enlightenment, University of Chicago Press, 2012, and Visual Voyages, Images of Latin American Nature from Columbus to Darwin, Yale University Press, 2017. She is currently writing a curatorial biography of the Codex Mendoza, an indigenous illustrated manuscripts produced in early colonial Mexico. She traces the extraordinary life of these transcultural objects from Mexico City in the 1540s to London in the 1830s. And today she's going to speak about rethinking the Aztec's past, rethinking the Codex Mendoza. Please welcome Professor Bleichmar.
Thank you so much. Let me get settled here. I want to start with thank you to Caroline for this invitation, and especially to Erin McWhirl, who was so amazing in making this happen with a level of efficiency, but also warmth that I really, really appreciate. You're all very lucky to have Erin in charge of this meeting, and I am very lucky that she was so patient with me. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I tried to get the front lights to dim so that you could see the manuscript that I'm going to talk about in all its glory, but it's either off or on, and on a Friday at this time of the afternoon, I don't think, I'm going to try to be very lively, but I don't think I can do it. So unfortunately, this is the best we will do. So this is a Codex Mendoza. As Caroline mentioned, I am in the thick of the process of finishing this book that I've been working on for a long time, and I'm so excited to be talking about it to you because you are my ideal audience. How many of you are familiar with this? Raise your hand if you had heard of the Codex Mendoza. Oh, wow, okay. My people. What can I say? So, on the screen, you see a manuscript known as the Codex Mendoza, a question that maybe we can discuss in the Q&A, because you will see that my ploy here is to tell you about this book and then to ask you many questions so that you help me as I am finishing it. We know it was created in Mexico City. We think that maybe that happened in the 1540s, so that's only about 20 years after the fall of the Mexica or Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan to the forces led by Hernán Cortés. And it is one of the most extensive, detailed, and heavily used source for the history of the Mexica. Much of what we know about Aztec society comes from this document and from other colonial codices that were produced in the 60 to 80 years after the conquest. But this is one of the earliest ones, and as I will describe, a very, very special one. And in preparing for this meeting, wow, this is such a confusing remote. Okay. In preparing for this meeting, I was very glad to see in the website of the BSA the definitions of bibliography that pretty much explain exactly what I am trying to do with this codex, which is look at how it was made, who made it, what the process was for its creation, and how that process is inscribed in the object itself, but also helps us to interpret in a way that is different if we did not look at that or know that. And that's one of the ways in which I am rethinking the Codex. I am proposing sort of a new stance for this source based on this bibliographical approach. But then what I am doing is I am not stopping as much art history does with the creation of the object, but I am following it as it moves across places, across media, across formats, and across time. So that is exactly, tick, 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 tick. I am very happy to see that. So the manuscript is in the format of a European-style book, a codex. It is on European paper. It measures roughly 12 by 8¼ inches. And it consists of 72 folios, partly dedicated to pictorial content that was created by indigenous painter-scribes, and then was heavily annotated with Spanish glosses on the paintings themselves, as you can see on the image on the right, and then accompanied on facing sheets with Spanish writing that describes what the painting shows. And the paintings were made by indigenous Tlaquiloque artist-scribes, and the writing was done by a Spanish notario, a legal scribe. The manuscript is divided in 3 sections. The first section is a history of the Mexica from the establishment of its great capital of Tenochtitlan, which you see on the right, through a succession of kings of Tlatoani, and for each of them discussing the years of the rule and the many different communities, or altepeme, that had been vanquished in war and brought into the Mexica Empire. So it's basically the passing of time as measured by military successes. So that's the first part. The second part, which is the longest, is about imperial economics. It is sort of the most beautiful rendering you can imagine of what is in some way sort of a tax form, because what it does is for each of those towns that had been subjugated by the Mexica, it is listing all the objects that they were required to pay as tribute to their conquerors. And it provides this incredible visual repertory of indigenous economy and goods in Mesoamerica before 1521. So a lot of what we know about the goods and the items and ideas of value and what was valued by these indigenous communities comes from this incredible record. And then the third part, and I think you can see, sorry, the angle is really hard. Yes, you can see at the very top of the verso that it says the third part of this history. So each of the parts is labeled and conceived as part of a whole. The third part is truly extraordinary, because if the first part tells us about military history, and the second part about imperial economics, the third part tells us about civil society in the Mexica world. And it starts with the birth of a child. So in the center of the scene in the bottom, you see a small basket with a newborn child, and surrounded by the mother at bottom left and the father at top left, and 2 religious leaders who are all speaking. The speech glyphs are that turquoise, precious speech that we see talking about the child and what their future will be. And at the very top, the figure is labeled the woman who has just given birth. So this is this incredible beginning of a life and the rites that accompany it in indigenous society. And then the manuscript takes us year by year in the upbringing of boys and girls. And on the left on sort of a left column, are boys always being closely watched by their fathers, and on the right, girls by their mothers. The turquoise circles that you see are the ages, and I chose this page. It starts with when children start contributing to the household and to society when they are just 4 or 5 years old, and this is a page when they're 11 to 14, the age of my own children. And as you can see at the very top, they have been bad. They are sassy. They are sassy twins, and they have gotten into trouble. And so they are being punished by burning chilies and holding their faces over the smoke of the burning chilies. And we see the tears coming, and so the parents are saying, this will not do. Further punishment when they're 12. By the time they're 13, they got it. They are really... This is so, some wishful thinking. They are really contributing to society. The boys are carrying loads. They are fishing. The girl is using a metate to grind corn. And in the bottom, the 14-year-old is fishing. On the right, the girl is weaving with a loom. And then we go to 15. What do you think happens at 15? Yeah, this is the difference between you and my students. When I ask my students, they say quinceañera, right? I'm like, no, she gets married. I'm not showing you that because I could go on. It just has such incredible detail about indigenous life in Mesoamerica, a detail that is just amazing to have as a historical record, and that was painted by indigenous artists who were working at a time when all of these incredibly deep social customs were being threatened and changed through colonialism, so that we have such a detailed record of what life was at a moment when that way of life was being persecuted is particularly important and meaningful from this manuscript. I'm showing you a opening that is very famous. It addresses governance in the Mexica world, and our historians are very excited about this painting on the right because it is a form of perspectival rendering, which is not a Mexica painting convention. It is one that 20 roughly years after the conquest, this indigenous artist is aware of and is choosing to depict or choosing to employ here. But what is more interesting, or not more interesting, but what is also very interesting to me is the view of governance that is suggested by the image and by the text, because there is great emphasis on the high level of sophistication and civilization of the Mexica political system, on the magnificence of Moctezuma, who is shown, Moctezuma II, who is shown at the very top, and the ways in which the text describe his rule. They use this very specific phrase, which is orden y buen gobierno, order and good governance. And that is not a random phrase, that is a very specific concept in political theory at the time that talks about the highest form of governance, right? This is what a monarch should aspire to. So, and the phrase is in the Spanish. So the indigenous painters and the indigenous narrators who were involved in producing this conveyed information that the Spanish interpreter and the Spanish scribe set down in these terms that were the ones used in political thought at the time, and in Spanish political thought at the time, to describe just rulership. That is a very important statement after the conquest, right? These are not people who are being described in the ways that had been used in many other sources to describe indigenous peoples across the Americas. These are describing a society that is being compared to the highest, most organized, most well-run, most sophisticated society possible at the time in both native and Spanish terms. So this is the last folio and is one that is not illustrated, and so it's perhaps the least exciting, right? After you go through all these amazing paintings, you get to this. But this is a folio that for me was sort of like the key that unlocked the document, because it is a folio that breaks the fourth wall, in which the scribe addresses not exactly the reader, it's not dear reader, but it says, it talks about the making of the manuscript. And it says, I know that the prose is really rough, but we were in such a rush to make it. And then it gets into matters of translation, which I think is so interesting. And it made me see that the whole project of this manuscript, of how it was made and of what happened to it afterwards, we can think through translation. Translation was central to mid-16th century Mexico. Every element of life in an indigenous polyglot empire that was now dealing with a colonial administration that added yet one more language to a very polyglot situation involved interpreting between languages, interpreting between cultures, interpreting between religious systems, and interpreting between writing systems, indigenous pictography and Spanish alphabetic writing. And so what the text says about translation is, it first criticizes the translator. It says, the interpreter made some mistakes because he referred to the indigenous churches, temples, as mosques. And it referred to the indigenous priests as al-faqih, which is a word that comes from the Arabic. And it says, those terms are inappropriate because they are moriscos, right? Is the Spanish word for what happens to the converts from Islam to Christianity. And the Islamic history, hundreds of years of Islamic history in Iberia. So it is using the terms that are very, very familiar to Spaniards, to conquistadors, the terms of the Reconquista, right? Of the Christian crusade against Islam that was framed not as a war over territory, but as a reconquering, right? And that gets transposed. So he says he should have called them temples, he should have called them priests. And then he says, but he's still a pretty good interpreter because he knows Nahuatl pretty well. And so to me, it was mind-blowing that this scribe, after this entire text, took a full folio, a full page, to tell us what he thought was a problem, and that the central problem was one of translation and of accuracy in translation. What happened to the Codex, I propose that the Codex is basically the result of 3 translations. And I am interested in the early modern meaning of the word translation that has a double meaning that has been lost today. One means to turn something from one language into another. But the other one means to take something from one place to another, translation. latio, to take from place to place. And in the first dictionary of any European vernacular, which is Covarrubias 1611 Dictionary of Spanish, he gives those two. And early English dictionaries have the same. And so guided by this notion, I started thinking of the Mendoza as in three movements or three translations. And in this, I was very interested in Halley's interest in movement and insert movement between manuscript and print and movement from place to place, because this is central to this story. So in the book, I argue that the very making of the Mendoza is a result of numerous translations, moving from pictorial Aztec pictography to an oral register that I haven't even talked about yet, but I'd be delighted to talk about, to written, from Nahuatl to Spanish, from a writing system that is pictorial to one that is alphabetic, but also in cultural meanings, because pre-contact practices are translated according to colonial interpretations. And this is done by the indigenous painters first and foremost. They're very specific in what they present as a history of the Aztec empire. There's so little about religion, for example. It's like, yeah, we're not going to talk about that, right? There was nothing more flammable, literally, in Mexico City at this time than speaking of religion. So the indigenous painters are already choosing how to frame the indigenous past in a way that is powerful and serves their purposes for the indigenous present. And the Spanish interpreters and writers are also translating, so that it's all these incredible layers of translation that produce a manuscript, but that also we need to take into account when we interpret it, right? We cannot see it as a sort of open, transparent window through which we can glimpse a past. It is a window that shows us some things through that crystal, right? That colors it, that refracts it, that changes it. And that is something that is very important to consider. That was the first translation. The second translation is a physical one. And the Codex Mendoza was made for export. It was made to be sent to Spain. And in this, it is not alone. It is part of a wave of incredible creativity, incredible production of manuscripts by indigenous painter-scribes, working often with Franciscan missionaries in creating these manuscripts that were created to be sent to Spain. And so the three that I show you in the bottom are all produced within a Franciscan context expressly for export. The Mendoza is distinctive in this. It is the only one that is not involving missionaries. And this has been, how to say, so unusual that I think the scholarship has really had a hard time letting go of that and really been like, surely there was a friar somewhere, right? And I mean, you know, I don't want to laugh at the incredible scholarship that has been made on this manuscript that has made my work even possible, but the insistence that there has to be a missionary somewhere, I think we have to let go of. I think that the manuscript very clearly tells us that this was done in a very different context, and I'm happy to talk more about it. But it was part of these objects that were made to be sent away. And it is one of the earliest of them. It is one of the most detailed in providing this view of is the world as seen from Tenochtitlan. It's like that New Yorker cartoon of the world seen from Manhattan. It starts with Tenochtitlan and everything is about Tenochtitlan, right? It's not providing, for example, the Florentine Codex is made in Tlatelolco, and it's really like the world as seen from Tlatelolco. The Relación de Michoacán is made in Michoacán, and it really has a Purépecha view of the world. They are each written from a place. Part of why it's so important is because we have a wealth of early colonial manuscripts. We have, per the sort of standard census, about 400 early colonial manuscripts, but we have about 15 pre-Hispanic. 400 after the conquest, about 15. And that is because they were persecuted and destroyed as part of the work of conquistadors and missionaries. I'm showing you an illustration by an unknown artist in a manuscript produced around 1585 that tells the history of the conquest as seen from Tlaxcala, the Tlaxcalteca view, in which they are the great heroes. And this shows a scene of something that happened after the conquest. We see in the drawing 2 men in Franciscan garb setting fire to what the text describes as the clothing and books and apparel of the idolatrous priests. So the reason we have so few pre-Hispanic codices is because they were savagely destroyed. And so the importance of these early colonial ones is in part as a result of that. So the Codex Mendoza is made in this intricate way. It is telling the view of the world from Tenochtitlan. It is made to be sent to Spain. But then something really interesting happens, which is, and here we go to its second translations, its physical translations. It's made in Mexico around 1540s. Somehow, we don't know how, it ends up in Paris, perhaps around 1553, where a man by the name of André Thevet, who was at one point a royal cosmographer. He had been part of a failed French mission to Brazil. He was a prolific author on works on the Americas. He owned it. He signed it in 5 different places. And we don't know how he got it. It seems that at some point he suggests there were pirates involved. But everything with Thevet you have to read with some, he was a very good storyteller. Then from Thevet, it goes to Richard Hakluyt. By 1587, so Richard Hakluyt, one of the great compilers of travel narratives and promoters of English colonial ventures, imagined at that point more than realized in North America. From there, by 1616, to Samuel Purchas, another great compiler of travel narratives and promoter of English voyages. And then, after Purchas's death, to John Selden, the great jurist and one of the architects of naval law, designed precisely to frame certain kinds of colonial expeditions, rights to waters, and one of the great collectors, maybe you're familiar with Selden's map of China. He had a very, very wide collection of manuscripts, and after his death, the library passed to the Bodleian Library in Oxford. So basically, the Codex Mendoza, this manuscript, passed through sort of a who's who of European writers about a globalizing world and theorists and sponsors of imperialism. It is said to be rediscovered in the very late 1820s by Edward King, Viscount Kingsborough, and we will get to that later. And this word rediscovered made me think of Yolanda's manuscript. I would say that it is normally described in the literature as rediscovered. And when I went to see at Oxford and I asked the curator, what does it mean that it was rediscovered? With great self-control, this is, I think I could just imagine something less control under the skin. He said, we never lost it, right? And I am completely convinced, of course, the library held it, the librarians knew it was there. What rediscovered means is not that it was lost, but that we don't know that anyone paid any attention to it, right? That people didn't look at it. I think it's really interesting to think what it means for the manuscript to be lost and rediscovered, because as I will show, unlike your manuscript, this manuscript had a very long and rich life in print, while the manuscript was in the bowels of the library. And I'll just say that as a historian of the early modern world, one of the ideas that I was sort of raised with was that collections, like cabinets of curiosities, like libraries, are places of knowledge production. And part of what has been so interesting in looking at this indigenous manuscript is that that idea doesn't really work for indigenous objects. It works for certain kinds of objects, natural history objects, but for indigenous objects, collections and libraries were not, in the early modern period, places of knowledge production. They're places to hold objects and to make them mean many, many different things that had much more to do with the collectors and the authors than with the objects. And that's what I will spend the rest of my time on. Because while it was, I don't know, I don't want to even use the word lost even with quotation marks, while it was deep in the Bodleian, and we have, it's such an interesting sort of, gestalt shift, because it's always talked of as held and then rediscovered. And it is when Selden's collection of manuscripts was cataloged, I assume there are catalogers here, yes? So it was manuscript Selden A1. Right? And when the catalog of the Bodleian is published, it is mentioned in print. So the catalogers and the librarians knew exactly where it was, and it was in the Selden wing, and here's where maybe you and my students come together, because if you've seen any of the Harry Potter movies, the library in those movies is the Selden wing of the Bodleian Library. So it was there. Right, a new, like a purpose-built, wonderful place to hold Selden's collection, of which this was manuscript A1. But while it was in the library, and we really have no evidence of anyone looking at it between 1625 and 1820, so for 200 years, it had its third kind of movement or translation through publication, because Samuel Purchas included it as part of his 1625 Hakluytus Posthumus, or Purchas, his Pilgrims, the Pilgrims as it is known. And Andreas, I was thinking of you, or your paper was making me think of this title page, because he defies your curve. I think I have a detail of the engraved frontispiece. Oh my God, I can't read it from here. right? The word world is the leitmotif, right? And below you see the author in what I have come to think of as the global sandwich portrait, literally between the two halves, the two hemispheres of the world. So this idea that a book contains worlds and that the entire world is presented in the book is central to Purchas and to many of the publications. And in this, I wish he were more concise. Purchas. He is really not. The title page is just the beginning of it. But he reproduced the Mendoza. Wow, where am I? Okay, here we go. In the third volume, Book 5, Chapter 7, it is the longest chapter in the volume, in a very long work. It extends over 53 pages, and it is by far the most heavily illustrated chapter in the entire publication. And the title of the chapter is The History of the Mexican Nation, described in pictures by the Mexican author, explained in the Mexican language, which expositions translated into Spanish and thence into English, together with the said picture history, are here presented. And my point is not that he's wordy, he sure is, but my point is that he is so attentive to the process of production of the manuscript. He's saying, there were some paintings, and then they were made by a Mexican, Mexica, painter, and then they were explained in what he calls the Mexican language, Nahuatl, and then that was translated into Spanish and then written down. And then he pays someone to translate it into English, and he publishes it. So this idea of the many translations and movements that are part of making the manuscript are ones that he is attentive to. And then what he does is, oh wait, I will get to that. Why is Purchas publication so important? It's not just because I'm obsessed with the Codex Mendoza. It is so important because the Codex Mendoza was just one of many indigenous manuscripts that were in European collections at the time, just giving you some examples. So multiple manuscripts indigenous manuscripts from Mexico were arriving to Europe and circulating as gifts, also stolen, and being held in prominent collections and looked at. But they proved impossible for Europeans to interpret. And I'm going to give you just very quickly two examples. So this is the Codex Vienna. It's a Mixtec Onyutsawi manuscript, and it is one of the earliest known to be in Europe before the fall of Tenochtitlan. It was already there. It is believed to be among the first objects that were sent from what is now Mexico to Europe. It is featured in the Museum Wormianum. If you study cabinets of curiosities, you know this book, you know this depiction of Ole Worm's cabinet, and Worm never had it. It was not in his collection, but he was so interested in it that he got from his friend Job Ludolf, who was one of the great scholars of Ethiopia in the 17th century. Ludolf had been in Munich and had seen the codex, and he copied a small section, a small fragment, and sent it to Worm in Copenhagen and said, hey, you and I are both really interested in different ways of writing. I saw this manuscript. I have no idea what it means, but I thought you might like it. And Worm reproduces or has a woodcut reproducing this segment, this fragment from the Vienna Codex. So these are really interesting objects. These scholars are very, very excited to see them. They're copying them. They're sharing them with their scholar friends. They're reproducing them. Very, very interesting stuff. But when it comes to saying what they are, Worm says, these are Mexican hieroglyphs established with astonishing figures depicted in various colors, okay, from which hardly anyone has deduced anything. So it's like, I have no idea. They have great affinity with certain figures among those that the extremely renowned gentleman Johannes de Laet depicted in Book 5, Chapter 10 of his description of the West Indies. And we will come back to this. So he's saying, these are amazing hieroglyphs. I have no idea what they mean. No one can read them. But this looks like something I saw in another book, right? Like bibliographical detective work happening. Then we have another famous engraving of a curiosity cabinet, that of the Cospi collection in Bologna. And this collection did have a pre-Hispanic manuscript known as the Codex Cospi, and I'm showing you here a facsimile, because they would never let me photograph the original like this, but I wanted to show you the screenfold format, right? And the two different sides were painted at different times by different artists, as you can see, just to give you a sense of the physicality of these objects and how different they are from the Codex format that the Mendoza has. So Cospi had this one in his collection, and if very few fragments from it are also included in the publication of the collection. Here it is called a libro mexicano, a Mexican book. Does this have a pointer? Yes. Do you see this one? I am convinced that they chose these of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds because it looks Egyptian, because they are obsessed with the relationship between Egyptian hieroglyphs and indigenous pictography, American indigenous pictography, and they keep calling them hieroglyphs. So, Libro Mexicano, Mexican hieroglyphs, which are most extravagant figures, and for the most part, they depict strangely monstrous men and animals. Okay. What they mean, I do not know, nor do I know of others in Europe who know it, not having yet found anyone who has mentioned them and shed any light on them. It would be a beautiful and curious undertaking for someone else to shed light on the darkness shrouding these literary mysteries not yet explained in Europe. So this to me is incredibly interesting, right? Like, cabinets are places of knowledge production, except when they're not, except when the greatest minds are looking at these indigenous objects and saying, like, I have no idea, these are monsters, they're strange, wouldn't it be great if someone else figured it out? Oh, this is very interesting. So these are the boards that were affixed to the Codex Cospi, and as I hope you can see, there's a palimpsest there, because what is now registered as Libro del México underneath shows the traces, can you guess, do you know, of before having said Libro de la China. Let me see, this, my script didn't show up. Do you see underneath? So at some point they're Egyptian, at some point they're Chinese. And it's not that they don't care, they care. That's why they bother to redo it. And when they figured, oh, no, it's not Chinese, it's Mexican, they corrected it. They desperately want to know, but they just can't do it. The only indigenous manuscript that is legible and widely circulated in Europe before the 1830s is the Codex Mendoza through Purchase's edition. So what Purchase does is translate all the Spanish text into English, have woodcuts made of almost the entire manuscript. It is the first reproduction of an American Indigenous manuscript in Europe, 1625. The next one will be 1830, 200 years later, right? So for those 200 years, Purchas's version is the one that everyone reads. And what happens is really interesting, because Purchas publishes this chapter in a work that has thousands of pages, right? I have been talking only about this chapter, but there are 4 volumes, and each of them is about 1,000 pages, right? So unless you're looking for this or reading very closely, you would think people would miss it, but they don't, because between 1625 and 1830, there's 7 additional versions of the Mendoza, printed again by a who is who of different approaches to scholarship in Europe. And part of what is so interesting is that I told you that we don't know that anyone looked at the Mendoza for 200 years. So what happens is that we have the original manuscript. Purchas has it. He pays someone to translate. He pays someone to reproduce the woodcuts. And then, poof, right? We don't know that anyone else looks at the Mendoza for 200 years. But what they look like is a Purchas's version. And they use it selectively to write many, and I mean many, different histories in which who the Aztecs are, what pictography is, what it means to have this object, changes depending on the interests and purposes of the author. So I'm quickly running out of time. I'm just going to show you a few of them. Very quickly about Purchas, he never claims it's a facsimile. He's not interested in reproducing the manuscript. What he's interested is in giving 2 sets of information that he sees as separate: indigenous pictography, textual explanation. And this is typographically further, there's a separation that this version does where the materiality of the manuscript is lost, so that you don't know who is the author of the text. And even though in the title he tells you a Spanish author wrote this, and I am translating it, by the time you are going through the pages and reading this in English and hearing Purchas's voice, his voice becomes the narrative, the sort of the loudest one. And very interestingly, one of the running headers in this part is Mexican history in pictures, chronicle without writing. And that to me is super interesting, because I showed you the manuscript. There's writing everywhere. Every painting has every glyph glossed. The towns, every time they appear, and there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, the word pueblo is there. Right? Even if a gloss appears hundreds of times. So the writing is incessant, it's excessive. Chronicle without writing. And what this is doing is separating the indigenous pictography from the Spanish writing and saying the indigenous pictography is a book, everything else is a commentary, and forgetting or sort of suturing this, no, it's the opposite of suturing, is separating these 2 elements that in the manuscript are inseparable because they were made to relate to each other, to create an indigenous world that is always ancient, is always pictographic, is always without writing, is always in the past, even though this manuscript was made in 1540. It's not an ancient manuscript. And to have the writing always be the European modern versus the indigenous ancient, even though in the manuscript they are together. And I'm just going to, as you can see, now that we can do this, no one for those 200 years could, but now that we can compare a page from the manuscript to a page from the Purchas version, we can see that they're very, very different versions of, not of the object, but of the material. So Johannes the Lad, right? The guy that in the Cosby book, it says like, I don't know what these mean, but they remind me of these images that Johannes the Lad published. So Johannes the Lad was a Dutch cartographer, but also one of the founding members of the Dutch West India Company, and a critic of Spanish colonialism and an advocate for Dutch overseas ventures. And he publishes selected images, and by selected I mean like a tiny, tiny, tiny number of them in his History of the New World or Description of the West Indies, in which, of course, he has a commercial interest himself. And the view that he gives of this manuscript is extremely different from that of Purchas. He is interested in language, he's interested in translation. You see on the left a table in which he is counting and giving the names of things in Nahuatl. And I think for reasons of time, I'm just going to go there. I'm not going to talk about this, even though it pains me. Kircher, yes? Yes. So Kircher, in his Oedipus Aegyptiacus, in which he does this massive work of trying to reproduce and interpret every Egyptian inscription known to Europeans at the time, part of what the text does is a comparative history of religions, and these are images from the chapter in which he proves that the Aztecs were really descendants of Egyptians, because pyramids, check. The sun and the moon, check. Hieroglyphs, check. I mean, what more evidence do you need? And so, because the origin of indigenous peoples of the America had been a heated and debated topic for 100 years previous, and one of the hypotheses was they're descendant from Egyptians, and so for Kircher, they are. And in his book, he also includes part of Purchas's Mendoza as part of this exploration of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Melchizedek Thévenot, a French author of a collection of voyages. I'm going to go through this very quickly. I'm not going to take you through all 9. Don't be scared. But what I want to show you is on the left, the title page of the segment on the Mendoza in this voluminous collection, the history of the Mexican Empire represented in figures, no writing, right? These are a people, chronicle without writing, people without writing, and as you can see, he actually pays somebody to cut anew the blocks, to cut new blocks based on the Purchas, but there's no writing anywhere. So Purchas had tons of writing that he sort of divorced from the paintings by saying, no, that's just commentary. Melchizedek Thévenot doesn't even include the Spanish. It's all pictorial. All pictorial. And it is not until an entirely different pamphlet after all of this that if you go looking for it, you will find the text. So we see this progressive excision of the textual and pictorial elements of a manuscript that was made precisely to make them inseparable through these publications. I do want to mention very briefly Clavijero, because Clavijero was a Mexican Jesuit who, after the expulsion of the Jesuits from Spanish territories, is in Italy and publishes a book called The Ancient History of Mexico, excavated, I like that very active verb for the writing of history, of the best Spanish historians and from manuscripts. I can't see. And from the ancient paintings of the Indians. So if all the other authors are saying, we don't know what these paintings are, they make no sense, the writing is different, what Clavijero is doing is historiographically revolutionary, and he is very much indebted to Mexican Creole writers who are proposing a new way of writing indigenous history in which indigenous paintings are some of the most valued sources, combined with European writings, but claiming a role for these sources that had not been proposed with such intensity before. And you see, first he has a section on his sources, right? So he feels so modern as a historian. He's like, here's all the sources I consulted, and he goes through the Spanish writers, and then he goes, the pinture, right? The paintings. And can you see which one is number one? I cannot see from here. La Raccolta di Mendoza, the collection of Mendoza. First time ever, 1780, this name Mendoza is associated to this manuscript. Before, 1550s to 1780, no one ever said this name. And this name is the name of the first Spanish viceroy of Mexico. Ever since, we have called it the Codex Mendoza. I can explain to you why he called it that, maybe later, but it does a very powerful move because it connects the only legible indigenous manuscript in Europe at that time for 150 years to this very, very prominent figure who was the first Spanish viceroy. So it gives it a pedigree that makes it extra credible. And then what he does, so the images on the left are Mexica warrior uniforms, which are beautifully and extremely meticulously detailed in the Mendoza. This was a warrior culture, and military uniforms were extremely important. And on the right, Chimali shields. But as you see, he has no interest in the manuscript itself, right? These are glyphs from the Mendoza. So he's interested in what information he can excavate from it, not on the manuscript itself. This is Humboldt. I'm not even going to talk about Humboldt. I really wanted to talk about Clavijero. Humboldt, let's move on. I mean, if I had more time, but then I would keep you here forever. But basically, the story that I am trying to reconstruct is that for 200 years, this was the only indigenous manuscript that was legible and interpretable to Europeans and to many Mexican scholars as well, and that Purchas's version was used to create many multiple histories of the Aztecs, of indigenous peoples, of indigenous pictography, of indigenous civilization, always through this 1625 version. And so this idea of the stability of the object that is so important for art history, I think it's pretty much exploded through this case study. Sort of the ontological, right? The idea that this is one thing and maybe a portion chips and we restore it and we conserve it and that's what matters is destroyed by this story where what the object is always being translated, is always being reinvented, and the object is not even present for these 200 years until the antiquities of Mexico. That word, antiquities, so interesting for an object that was made in 1540. But the very first one is the Codex Mendoza, the collection of Mendoza. And very quickly, I just want to show you how we get it in color after 200 years, right? It's the first time that, there was color, who knew? An incredible project that involved having the Italian artist Agostino Alio do this. You guys were talking about what it's like to visit collections, and you need the visa, and you need the funding. So Kingsborough spent all of his money sending Alio around from library to library to trace the manuscripts, and then publishing this multi-volume, gigantic lithographic collection that broke him. He died in debtor's prison. He totally, this is really a history of bibliomania till the death. It really is. But I want to show you, we get the Mendoza in color, and as you can see, Alio did an incredible work of trying to reproduce. I call this is the original tracings of many of these survive at the British Museum. And yes, it's not perfect, but there is clearly a lot of attention to many things. At the very top, you see André TV, Cosmographe du Roi. Right there is where he signed it in 1553 or thereabouts. But of course, we know that this vision of the Mendoza is a very specific one. It's one where this is a chronicle without writing, where there's no text. And this is the first image in volume 1 of a 9-volume, and the text does not come till the first volume of text, which is later, and for almost every other source, is what other writers have written. This is the only one that has a text this long. And so that presence is gone. So this history of reproducing and reinterpreting continues till this day. I'm showing you here the landing page of the digital Mendoza. I call this a website that changed my life. It really did. It was published in 2014 as a collaboration between the Bodleian and the National Institute of History and Anthropology in Mexico, which called it a digital repatriation. 2014, 10 years ago, a digital repatriation. So where these objects are is a very important question. What names we give them is another important question. And this is a story of reinvention that continues till this day. Thank you very much.
So we'll manage the Q&A the same way that we did during the New Scholars Program. Please raise your hand, and I will call on members of the audience, or Professor Bleichmar, you can do that. And I'm actually going to ask the first question, because I have a mic in my hand.
And you really have earned it.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the loss of color in the woodcuts and what exactly it is in terms of meaning that we lose in the black and white images. And if you have seen any copies of the purchases, Pilgrims, that has color applied, and what that might indicate as well.
Oh, yeah, thank you. That's a great question, because the color matters so much. So different colors have different meanings in indigenous painting, as they do in every tradition of painting. Am I back to my first slide? Or is this just, yeah. So that blue, which you see so prevalent is made from, it's called Maya blue, and it is a color that is used to indicate things that are precious, things that are important, things that are valuable, and what you see going around is year glyphs, is time. So time is so important that each year is colored in blue. Speech can be very important, and so the speech glyphs, and you see it here, there's only one on this man who is labeled Tenoch, who has the speech glyph in blue, and the name for the imperial ruler in the Mexica Empire was the Tlatoani, and that literally means the speaker, the one with the word. So all the Tlatoani or Tlatoque are shown with the blue glyph. So there's incredible sort of cultural importance to the colors. And then in terms of the manuscript as a work, not only of information, but as a work of art, I think is incredibly important to how it is seen. I think also the use of color is something that, for me, is what is really interesting of this as an early colonial manuscript, because you see both the use of symbols and of colors in ways that are long-standing and traditional, and we know from the surviving pre-Hispanic codices, but also from mural paintings and from other forms. But you also see innovation. You also see, I don't know if you can see here, but you see the introduction of shading, for example, to show volume and drapery in fabric, and that is a European pictorial practice, not an indigenous one. And so you start seeing the beginning of this pictorial bilingualism that these indigenous artists have, where they have multiple idioms at their disposal and they can select elements from both. So all of that is lost, the sort of symbolic elements, artistic elements, and also clues to historical interpretation all disappear. I have never seen a copy of the purchase that is colored, so if anyone ever sees one, please tell me. I don't know, I would put money on it that there isn't. I don't think this is part of the concern at this time, and I think it becomes part of the concern in the 1830s in a different way. Thank you, that's a great question. There's a hand here.
Thank you. That was a wonderfully rich paper, almost too much to process at once. I have a question less about the bibliographic or artistic part of your talk than the historical part. I was really fascinated when you talked about colonial reinterpretation of the history of indigenous peoples, because I was in Australia about 6 months ago at some academic conferences where that's the very subject as a part of what they call the history wars in Australia, about the difference between what was history as told by the colonial settlers and what is now going on from the perspective of indigenous people. Do you consider that comparative part?
And let me just, I'm gonna follow on. I kept thinking about losing the words was a way of kind of savaging this people and uncivilizing. And I was also thinking about the paintings in the churches in Cusco, where you've got the Catholic imagery, but with the faces and bodies of the indigenous people. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. This is the entire field of 16th century Mexican studies, pretty much, incredibly important. So, I mean, I guess one way to come at it is that the situation in 16th century Mexico is very different from the situation in other places where indigenous people are being subjected to war and colonial invasion. In Mexico, the indigenous population is always at the heart and demographically is always present and is always a central part of the elites, of the power, of the culture. So there is, of course, terrible loss, but we also have a level of evidence for indigenous lives in 16th, 17th century Mexico that we don't have everywhere. And the question of what happens when you have indigenous cultures, which often is reduced to indigenous culture, but there are many cultures, many languages, many traditions, and Spanish ones has been central to the history of cultural transformation in early colonial Mexico. And basically, you have these objects that combine different elements to different degrees at different moments in time, depending on when they're made, who makes them, for whom they make them, what purpose they're doing. So to say that hybridity is here is almost pointless in the sense that there's no purity before the Spaniards arrive. It is always a polyglot, multicultural, indigenous world, and it continues to be polyglot and multicultural with different pressures, for sure. But where the mixing of elements is so omnipresent and so central that to say these things are mixed is like, and so part of what is interesting to me is that there is this tremendous destruction of Tenochtitlan, more so than of other places. The great metropolises get attacked with a virulence that is particular and is specific. And the city is razed. The temples are set on fire. The manuscripts are burned. I said that we have about 15 manuscripts. We have 4 that are Maya, and the other, and the other 6 and 5 are either Mixtec or from the Puebla-Tlaxcala region. We don't know for certain of a single manuscript from Tenochtitlan surviving, right? Like, this is the most powerful empire in Mesoamerica at the time, and we don't know that a single manuscript survived. But we have hundreds of manuscripts that are made after by different authors in different contexts about their history. And so we have many, many versions of history, and what is particularly interesting and rich is that you see how the indigenous authors, like the Spanish, English, Dutch, Italian authors, are writing the stories that best suit their purposes, that are most convincing to them, where who did what when is always being presented in ways that are very, they're writing pasts that are useful for the present, always. And so you have all of these amazing sources to read against each other and to try to excavate. The question of divorcing the writing, so first printing press, first university in the Americas is the Indigenous College of Tlatelolco, 1536, 1539, right? 100 years before the first university in what is now the US. First printing press, 1539. So this is a society that is highly literate in many languages and in different scripts from very, very early on. There's always writing. Sometimes it's pictorial, sometimes it's alphabetic. The move of saying indigenous people are people without writing is definitely a power move that has very specific connotations, And with some indigenous people is, as I think you said to me, what was your exact way? Savaging, to make them appear savage. With the Mexica, it's complicated because the sacrifice is always described as savage idolatry. But every other element, they're not savages. They are described as having orden y buen gobierno. They're described as being incredibly wealthy, incredibly powerful, incredible warriors. Both indigenous and Spanish sources are always talking about the bravery of these warriors and the amazing feats that they conducted in the history, super dramatic history of the conquest. So it's not that they're never savages, but they're ancient. And so this is one of the things that interests me in the book at a time when the writing of history is being reinvented in Europe, what it means to make some people always ancient. Tenochtitlan was established in 1325, and its fall is in 1521. So they're never ancient, ever. Right? It's not that they are ancient and then they remain, it's that they are made, they're anciented. Yeah. I don't think it's savagery. I think it's like, the Florentine Codex starts with these images of the Mexica pantheon, and they're inscribed another Hercules, another Jupiter. So they're made ancient like the Greeks and the Romans are ancient, which is a good way to be ancient, but they're kept always ancient. And so by the 18th century, this displacement of like faraways long ago, has a very different political valence because it's no longer they're like the Greeks and Romans, it's like they're always in the past. It becomes closer to later evolutionary models where different societies are considered to be contemporaneous, but in different moments.
I'm afraid that's all we have. Well, Caroline, you're in charge.
Yeah,
what do you want to do?
You have to.
Thank you, Daniela. That was great. My question is about the binding of the manuscript.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could tell something about it. And I know the Cosby manuscript was rebound.
Yeah.
And so it's another form of translation, right? And did the same thing happen to the Mendoza
I should have
manuscript?
known, and I should have brushed up. There, I depend entirely on the codicological work of the curators at the Bodleian, who did this very deep study in the 80s when it was unbound and rebound. So it's very interesting because if you look at the manuscript today, it is believed that it has existed in the same form since the 17th century, and it is bound with some ancient some tables about ancient currency, about coins, about money, which have nothing to do with this, right? Like you're reading this and then it ends, and then you keep turning the pages, and then there's all these columns of currency conversions, basically. So the current binding is believed to have been done at some point after it arrived in Europe. And the curator, Bruce Barker Bensfield, who wrote about this, also noticed that the initial pages, you can see that they were folded in four, right? Like the entire manuscript, sorry. Somebody did this, right? Which is, but long before, and so there's this question like, oh, is that where pirates get involved? I don't know, these pirates, man. I don't know. But it was made in Europe, so it is not original, which makes total sense. I mean, part of my interpretation, as I think you saw, is that this is not an illustrated, it's not like a written book with illustrations. It's rather a copiously annotated portfolio of paintings, right? Like that's how we need to see this, right? These were paintings that were then annotated, and which is, the reverse of how later manuscripts in colonial Mexico were made.
Thank you.
You need to
Thank you very
read
much.
Bruce's work, basically. I'll just repeat what he wrote, yeah. There's a question here.
Erin will be back in just a minute, but I just want to say personally how nice it was for me having an art history background to see how art history can work with bibliography to really inform each other. So that was a real delight for me.
There was a question here.
Oh, there is. Are we still doing questions, Erin, or?
Yeah, we're going to have to start the meeting, I'm sorry.
Oh.
But thank you.
Thank you.